And so I now have the great pleasure to introduce Professor Raewyn Connell, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Sydney. She is, of course, world-renowned for her path-breaking work on masculinities and gender. More recently, for her equally path-breaking work in Southern theories and thinking from the global South. She is the author of innumerable books and articles, too numerous to even enumerate, on these themes and others, including education and universities in neoliberalism, class, gender, and global economics, and other themes. She is also a poet and has a wonderful collection of hats, which she's not wearing today. So today's paper is entitled Thinking from the South, Understanding Gender and Power in World Perspective. So please welcome Professor Raewyn Connell.
I want to start actually by going back, not exactly 50 years, but a fair way, to think about what the advent of what's often called second wave feminism meant for the world of knowledge that we work in universities. So I have long thought that the advent of the new feminism in the 1960s and 70s, if you like, symbolised by International Women's Day as an international event in 1975, represented a very fundamental revolution in knowledge. It represented what we might call an epistemological shift, a very, very profound critique of the forms of knowledge, the practices, institutions, styles of intellectual work, in which I had been trained as a student, and which I'd learnt to practice. This was now being very fundamentally called into question as having been produced by patriarchal social institutions and expressing the consciousness of a society in which women were oppressed. And that being so, knowledge itself became a field for contestation, for the struggle for justice for women, to overthrow institutionalised oppression and inequality. And the universities, therefore, were a legitimate terrain for this kind of struggle. That was a position that I and many other people came to in the 1970s, and it was pretty much the thinking behind the creation of women's studies and subsequently gender studies as a field of research and teaching and publication, which always attempted not just to create a new specialisation, a new sub-discipline, but to speak to the whole spectrum of knowledge that was represented in the knowledge economy. And I still think that insight in the 1970s was broadly correct. But I've changed the way I think about it, and I think that in that I'm on the same terrain as an increasing number of people who have been influenced by feminism, but have come to see the feminism of that moment, the feminism of this kind of politics, as deeply problematic in itself. And I want to make this thought concrete by referring to the work of an Algerian feminist, Mania Lazreg, who, a francophone, given that Algeria was a colony of the French for 150 years approximately, and only became independent as a result of a particularly bitter and violent liberation struggle in the 1950s and early 60s, which you will remember if you've ever seen the film The Battle of Algiers. Marnie Lasreg wrote in a paper that was published in English in 1990 that there was a significant error in feminist scholarship. And she meant that in a very broad sense. There was a fundamental problem in the way feminist scholarship had developed, which became highly visible to Algerian feminists when they read the work of French feminists, their sort of metropole in much the same way that American feminism is metropole to feminist research and thinking in Australia. Lasreg argued that French feminism had understood the situation of Arabic-speaking women in Algeria, and indeed more broadly across the Arabic-speaking world, in a highly particular way, through an interpretation of their situation in terms of difference from a kind of norm that was represented by French experience. The difference marked by geographical distance, by the presumed cultural difference of the North African societies, and especially by Islam. And therefore, because they were persistently read this way, their situation was interpreted this way by the authoritative voice of metropolitan feminism, Arab women in Algeria faced actually two struggles at the same time. One against local patriarchy, against the power and oppression that was everyday to them in Algerian society, but also against the dominance of European feminism in the world that they were trying to make. And that was an early statement, though certainly not the only one around that time, of the problem created by the fact that feminism, including academic gender studies which grew out of the new feminism, was actually part of a global structure, a global economy of knowledge, as we might now see it, which was marked by the greater wealth, the strength and productivity of the knowledge institutions of the global north, and of course the dominance of the languages of imperialism, English, French, Spanish especially, very visible to the Algerians. And this is an issue which all of us in our lives and practice in knowledge institutions like universities we are actually swimming in this, whether we have a way of naming it and analysing it or not. So I want to illustrate this with a map of the world. This is a map of the world in terms of academic journals in all disciplines put together: natural science, social science, humanities, the lot. Okay, and countries are shown in a size proportional to the number of academic journals they publish. So you can see what the world looks like in terms of the geography of the economy of knowledge. Enormous dominance of the United States. Next, Britain as the centre of some multinational publishing companies. Next, Western Europe. The rest of the world basically nowhere. Okay, now that part that dominates this, accounts at most for a fifth of the world's population. The great majority of the world's population are in South America, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and small population, of course, in the Pacific, but you can see where Australia fits into this story. It's a rather dramatic way of putting the point that that there is a massive dominance of this knowledge system by the institutions of the most privileged, the richest regions of the world, who happen to be the old centres of major imperial power. And what's true of the knowledge economy as a whole is also true of gender studies. So here is a list from one of those awful league tables of the high prestige, high status, high citation journals in gender studies. And you can't probably see it very well, but over in the right-hand column, they've helpfully put in little flags to show which country they come from. And there you go. United States, Britain, United States, Britain, United States, and so on. There's actually nothing else there. And, same in sociology, which I also fairly familiar with, same in the natural sciences and so on. It's just a basic feature of the institutional world we are working in. Now, when I say there is a dominance of the institutions in the richest regions of the world, I also said these are the regions that used to be the centres of global empire. And that is, I think, a fundamentally important point too, and it's one that has been particularly brought out by a very important African philosopher called Pauline Huntonji. I'll give you the spelling of the names I mention at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. Huntonji is very well known as a philosopher in Africa, not much known in other parts of the world, surprise. Has done quite fundamental work, I think, on the global politics of knowledge. And he's observed that what I'm calling the global economy of knowledge is based on a fundamental division of labour, which came into existence in the period of imperialism under colonial rule, where the global periphery, Africa, Spanish and Portuguese America, Australia, South Asia, the Pacific, basically served in the economy of knowledge as a kind of gigantic mine of information. So the colonisers, as well as bringing back the silver from Potosi and the coffee and the sugar from the slave states of the Caribbean and so forth, also brought back knowledge. Huge amounts of it. There was a traffic in knowledge, which was in fact fundamental to much of European science, in the natural sciences as well as in the social sciences. Where would the theory of evolution have come from if it hadn't been for Darwin's voyages on the Beagle, or Wallace's excursions in what was then the Dutch East Indies? I could go on, but there was, in fact, an enormous traffic in knowledge, which brought data from the colonised world back to the imperial centre, where it was processed. So in the institutions of the imperial centre, from the Royal Society to the universities, scientific associations, rich men's libraries, botanic gardens. Think of Sir Joseph Banks and the first European appropriation of data from Australia happened with the arrival of the Endeavour, from Eastern Australia, with the arrival of the Endeavour. In those institutions of the global north, the data were accumulated, thought about, theorised, and turned into the organised bodies of knowledge that we call science or university disciplines, and then re-exported to the periphery in the form of applied sciences like agronomy, administrative knowledge, all kinds of technologies that went into building of railways, mechanisation of mines, and so on and so forth. Ntonji further points out that this structure, this pattern of exchange, data from the periphery, theory and processing happening in the global metropole, persisted into the post-colonial period. It didn't die with political empires, but continues on into our world and is exactly illustrated by the map and the league table that I showed you. And that creates a particular situation for intellectuals in the global periphery, in the majority world, bear in mind, who wish to participate in the global economy of knowledge. They must adopt an attitude which Ntonji calls extraversion, that is, being oriented to intellectual authority from outside your own society, basically being oriented to the global north, where ideally you go for advanced training. You go and do, if you're really lucky, PhD at Harvard, the Sorbonne, whatever. You go for training in the laboratories of Germany, Cambridge, the United States. You try and publish in the top journals in your field, and lo and behold, they're all from America and Britain, which means you have to speak the methodological and conceptual language that those journals understand and like, and participate in the debates going on in the metropole. You have to, if you're going to participate in the global economy of knowledge. So extraversion becomes a fundamental condition of the lives and work of intellectual workers in the periphery, including Australia. When I first read Ntonji, I shivered. It was so perfect a description of what my experience in Australia had been, even though he was writing in in a very poor country in West Africa. And that's, that is, if you like, the situation we necessarily face if we want to participate as knowledge workers in this global process, to which most of us are indeed committed. And that, then creates all kinds of problems about the politics of knowledge. Among other things, the fact that theory is presumed to come from the metropole. So in gender studies, we read Simone de Beauvoir, we read, Judith Butler, we cite the people who cite them, and so on and so forth. We assume that what counts as theory, important thinking, is basically what comes from France, Britain, maybe Germany, and certainly the United States. And therefore, we habitually miss ideas, concepts, strategies, methods of knowledge formation that come from other parts of the world. Indeed, if you can read histories of gender studies, histories of gender theory, which simply never mention anyone from outside Europe and North America, as if the rest of the world never had an idea in its head about the subject of gender. But of course they did. And of course, the intellectuals of colonised societies tried to work out what was going on. Colonised communities too, had brains, had intellectual capacities, and a very clear interest in understanding what was happening under imperial rule and in post-imperial global inequalities. So that the mainstream approach to gender studies, in fact, would miss extremely important figures in the history of feminism and gender analysis, in the history of feminist movements, feminist thinking in other parts of the world. People, for instance, like Huda Sharawi, who was one of the founders of the Feminist Union of Egypt around 1920, never mentioned in northern. It is known to people making specific area studies, but in terms of general pictures of feminism, even the distinction between first and second wave feminism is a Eurocentric one. How do you account for someone like Huda Sharawi unless you take the position of analysing colonial situations as a fundamental task? Or, closer to home, indeed, the young woman on the left, Kartini, in the Dutch East Indies. I've never seen a reference, except in my own writing, to Kartini in any discussion of feminism, gender and education published in the global north. She's a national heroine in Indonesia. She's a pioneer of Indonesian nationalism, Indonesian feminism. She's the guiding saint, if you like, of women's organisations of all kinds in Indonesia. A very significant figure in feminist history and one of the pioneers of the strategy of changing oppressive gender relations through education. Quite an important line of thought. So we need to know about such people if we are really to be thinking about gender in a globally inclusive way. Now, thinking about gender and coloniality takes you into a different sort of conceptual space, into a space where other debates are also going on. And I want to mention at this point someone who's not a feminist, but who I think has done some work that is important for gender analysis. This is a Peruvian sociologist called Aníbal Quijano, who has a background in Marxism, and during the 1990s developed an analysis, a non-Marxist analysis in fact, of the nature of colonialism and the power structures that emerge in colonialism, in his part of the world, of course, the Spanish Empire, but which continue after the end of formal imperial rule. He developed a concept which is now widely circulated in postcolonial discussions, the concept of the coloniality of power, arguing that the institutions of colonised societies become oriented to the power of the metropole, to the colonising power, and that these structures persist after formal decolonisation. And indeed, we've just seen that illustrated in the realm of knowledge. There is likewise a coloniality of knowledge, we might say, and there is a coloniality of gender, because gender patterns in colonised societies are also reshaped by colonisation, not simply exporting the European gender order, but creating new gender orders in colonial situations. And they, historically persist after formal decolonisation. Okay, if we look now at colonisation as a fundamental concern in gender analysis, we first have to say, look, colonial conquest itself was a gendered process. It's not that we have gender here and coloniality or colonisation or imperialism there. That's the old, two spheres model of class and gender. And it wasn't like that. Colonisation was a strongly gendered process. It was, for instance, undertaken by from masculinised occupations in early modern Europe, soldiers, missionaries, priests, state administrators, sailors. And that continued throughout the history of colonialism. This is a 19th century artist's imagination of colonisation on the frontier in Australia, in 19th century Australia. And you can see he got a little bit wrong. He's got mixed up somehow in his image of how natives dressed. But the fundamental point that the picture is making is absolutely right. The conquest of Australia was a violent process. It involved military operations. And the force which carried it out was a masculinised military force. In fact, a number of different military forces were actually constructed in the first 100 years or so of colonisation in Australia. If you look at the history of colonialism in Spain, the conquistadores, okay, you're looking at a bunch of men. Same with the British in India, and so on. So there's a gendered process going on which involves one of the characteristic features of colonial conquest is mass rape, which disrupts kinship systems, as well as violating women's bodies on a massive scale. It involves the appropriation of land, which is also closely woven into the gender orders of colonised societies, and the significance of land rights in Australia will escape no one in this room. Amina Mama, one of the powerful feminist thinkers to have come out of Africa, in a paper on gender violence, contemporary gender violence, argues, and I think correctly, that you cannot understand the pattern or scale of gendered violence across Africa in the modern moment without understanding its roots in the violence of colonialism. The colonialism itself was a deeply violent process, and it did involve the disruption and sometimes almost total destruction of existing gender orders. This has, of course, been of concern to the colonised, and some very powerful writings have come out of decolonising situations about this kind of process, not only by women. I'm wondering, for instance, how many people in this room have read Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart? Cool. Everyone who didn't lift their hands should read it. It's a masterpiece of postcolonial literature, one of the founding texts in a way, and it is essentially a story about masculinity and the changing gender order of a West African society under the pressures of colonial conquest and missionary pressure. Colonial society, when we look at the history of the society that was produced by imperial conquest, we're also looking at strongly gendered societies, though they're gendered in new ways. Labour forces are structured by planters and pastoralists on strongly gendered ways. We see that in northern Australia, actually, when indigenous people were actually brought into the pastoral industry. As largely the men were brought in as stockmen, the women as domestic workers, and on, in other situations you see the same kinds of patterns in plantation economies in the Americas. Colonial power not only restructures gender relations, but it can appropriate for its own purposes gender patterns that already exist. This is pointed out, for instance, by the Indian historian Uma Chakravarti, who's written a very interesting book on caste. She's on the history of caste, the caste system, which has, of course, been something that the colonisers became very concerned about, in which she argues that caste is not, as often assumed, something analogous to race. It is actually a very specific configuration of gender relations. It's essentially about endogamous patterns of life. And it's a pattern of social organisation that, of course, pre-existed the British conquest, but was then appropriated by the British regime as a means of organising their relations with the society they had colonised and selecting out particular groups to become supporters and beneficiaries of the Raj. I could go on. I wanted to speak, for instance, about He Yinzhen, a Chinese feminist and socialist thinker of the early 20th century, who developed a powerful argument about the character of gender relations in developing capitalism. But I want to move on more quickly to think about the current kind of situation and the kinds of politics, the contemporary global dynamics of gender struggles. In the neoliberal era, where the old formal empires are dead, we still have massive inequalities on a global scale. And these inequalities are, to a significant extent, organised around gender or through gender. So if we're asking, for instance, who are the most powerful group, who are the group who control most of the levers of power in our world, we'd probably be thinking of people like this, the managers of transnational corporations. This is an image from an American business magazine, Fortune magazine, as it happens, who's, in this case, talking about a kind of organic intellectual of the global ruling class, someone who thinks about the nature of multinational capital. The image, of course, is a joke, and in fact a very nice joke, but it also reflects something. I mean, we've done some interviews, studies, not with people right at the top of the system, but certainly with people in the quite privileged levels of management. And this more or less represents the way they think. I mean, the world is their oyster. They do think they are responsible in some way for the prosperity of the world. They're holding up the global economy, and it's perfectly reasonable, therefore, that they should get salaries of the order of $10 million a year and upwards. Transnational corporations, which are now the largest economic institutions in the world, work to a very considerable extent through a gender division of labour. 95% and more of the top executives of these bodies are men. The international management is massively masculinized with a particular kind of masculinity, a little bit of cyborg masculinity, because these guys are tied into very sophisticated intranets and spend a lot of time, travelling the world on their computers, and creating internal networks in their world. But the products that their operations plan and produce and circulate are done by people in very different situations. This is one of them. This is from the global clothing industry, Mexican branch. This is in Maquila from northern Mexico, which is producing cheap clothing to a standardised international design for export across the border into the biggest consumer market in the world, the United States, probably via Waltons. And lo and behold, all the workers on the shop floor in this factory are women. And that is usual in the globally oriented clothing factories of South China that produce the South China economic miracle, which has, more than anything else, driven the growth of contemporary capitalism in China. So gender matters in the world of capitalism on a transnational scale, just as it does locally. And we don't have to spend much time on the web or looking at locally generated mass media, also to be seeing a profoundly gendered imagery of the world. I'm going to show you one somewhat striking corner of this, the web advertising of a particular industry in Thailand. This is an outgrowth of the cosmetic surgery industry, which is now quite a significant profit maker for the medical industries, which in Thailand has produced a specialised trade in gender reassignment surgery, where if you want gender reassignment surgery relatively cheaply, Thailand is now the place to go. It used to be Morocco. That's where reassignment became an export industry for a poor country, but that has now migrated largely to Thailand. And this image doesn't do it as strikingly as some other clinics' web advertising does, but if you look down at the right-hand bottom corner, you'll see very familiar kind of image of gendered imagery, which draws on the particular forms of sexist visual imagery familiar in the global metropole. Okay, so the coloniality of gender, the interweaving of global power and gender, which began 500 years ago, is still alive and well and comes out in the most diverse ways in the contemporary world. And this produces its own patterns of violence, conflict, and struggle. A couple of images ago, I showed you a maquila from northern Mexico. I now want to show you one of the consequences of that economy. In the city of Ciudad Juarez, just on the northern border of Mexico, on the border with the United States, where Donald Trump is proposing to build that wall, Juarez, which used to be a small rural township, is now a city of a couple of million people, which is notorious internationally for femicide, for the number of young women's bodies which turned up in the desert. It's in the middle of the desert. It's like Broken Hill, except that there's a massive flow of trucks through it from South and Central America to the United States. So hundreds of young women's bodies, many of them very brutally treated, even tortured, turned up in the deserts and vacant blocks of Juarez City. So many that a public scandal was created. An international outcry occurred, and a resistance movement arose among the women of Warriors, whose symbol is, well, the previous picture just showed some of the bodies with the police search going on. The symbol is the pink crosses, an image invented by the mothers of the disappeared women to call attention to the killing that was going on. Now, I suspect it's easy for outsiders to think, oh, right, this reflects, the brutality of Mexican men, the machismo, and all of this kind of stereotyped imagery. But Juarez is actually a neoliberal city, even more so, I guess, than Sydney. It's grown dramatically through the border trade. There are hundreds of maquila factories there, such as the one that I showed you before. It's even a key point in the most impressive and successful neoliberal export industry that's grown up in Central America, that is the trade in drugs. What's called narcotráfico is the site of a masculinized and very violent subculture with the private armies of the drug lords battling each other for control of this trade and battling the state for room to move. There's a very corrupt local environment. So what we have in Juarez City almost is a perfect product of neoliberal global relationships, where a toxic environment for women is created by the pressures of global capital, illegal trade, import-export trade that's such a crucial part of the modern neoliberal economy. Okay, that's one example of the global dynamics in our world. Another aspect which we don't often think about in gender research, as at any rate in the conventional forms that we get from the global north, is the issue of land. I've read books of gender theory, quite a number in fact, in which the word never appears, the idea never appears. And perhaps that's understandable, where land is not a central feature of economic struggle. But in the process of colonisation, land is crucial. Land is what it's all about in some fundamental sense. And rights to land, claims to land, use of land, occupation of land has continued to be a major political issue in most parts of the postcolonial world. Here's one quite famous example. People may have heard of the MST, Movimento Sem Terra, the landless people's movement in Brazil. It's not, I think, much involved in the dire politics that are going on in Brazil right this moment, where there's been effectively a constitutional coup against the woman who was elected president of Brazil, and right-wing forces have actually taken control of the government and introduced what my Twitter feed tells me is the first Brazilian cabinet since the military dictatorship that has no woman in it, not a single woman. It's like Tony Abbott, only worse. Okay, so this is the movement that has actually become internationally famous around the issue of land, movement of landless agricultural labourers trying to break down the highly concentrated pattern of land ownership that's persisted in Brazil from the colonial period on. And you may notice a feature of this, that everyone in that picture is a woman. This is actually a march for women's land rights in Brazil. It's a crucial question about land as to whether control of land in shifting from one set of men to another will also become open to women. This is an issue that's discussed in most detail by a feminist economist who I think is actually the most important gender theorist in the world in this generation. This is Bina Agarwal, who's known internationally as a development economist, connections in Cambridge, well published in the global north, but whose base is in Delhi, and who published now just over 20 years ago a great book called A Field of One's Own, which, if you haven't read, put that at the top of your reading list. That is perhaps the most important book about gender published in this generation. It's a magnificent study of issues around land and gender, about the variations in land rights, land use across South Asia. It's based on a great deal of field work, as well as remarkably clear thinking about gender politics in families, in villages, at the level of the state. Issues about poverty, issues about environment are all woven in to Bina Agarwal's work. So in her work, you see how issues of land can actually become central to a much wider discussion of gender and how gender relations change. Finally, the integration of the world through mass media, through markets, through finance, through the transnational corporations, has created a situation where links between different feminist movements also become more possible. So, as well as international capital and transnational patriarchy and so forth, we also have increasingly international feminism. I've had a little bit of experience of this. For instance, I was involved a bit over 10 years ago in a discussion among the United Nations agencies concerned with gender equality about the role of men and boys in moving from gender inequality towards a world of equality. The United Nations, so perhaps a little surprisingly, has become a major agency for the international connection of gender-based movements, feminist movements particularly, around the world since that first moment in 1975 when the United Nations declared International Women's Year. And it's gone on into the United Nations agencies, development strategies, health work, educational work through UNESCO and so forth. So we now have a degree of connection between gender researchers, gender equity policy workers, and feminist movements, feminist social movements, that didn't exist before. And that is, I think, quite an important asset, though it's one that always has to be approached carefully, because in that world, just as in academia, there is likely to be a continuing dominance of the global north. I want to finish these remarks by thinking about the changing ground for gender theory. I mean, if we're trying to think conceptually about gender, how do we now do so? What are the bases for generating new ways of thinking about gender. One of these is simply the circulation of intellectual workers themselves as the intellectual world becomes more internationalised. People move around more. So we have now significant figures in international feminist thought who are basically expatriates. This is sometimes called diasporic feminism. So Chandra Talpade Mohanty would be a notable example of that, who's been an important figure in bringing postcolonial issues to the fore in northern feminism and all of the rest of us who read northern feminist publications. There's also increasing concern to change the situation characteristic of the global economy of knowledge, where one part of the majority world learns about another part of the majority world via the metropole, basically. So by reading something like Mania Lasreg published in an American journal, someone in Latin America can learn about Algeria. But that all is filtered through the concerns, intellectual styles, theoretical ideas, and institutions of the global north. What about direct links around the global south? South-south links. These do exist, and there's increasing interest in what they can do. There's also, I think, another quite important force is simply the growing scale of gender research that's come out of this post-colonial world and continues to come from it. So since I've done research on questions of masculinity, I've been particularly aware of the amount of work, feminist influenced work on masculinity that's been coming out of post-colonial situations. Here's a very nice example, in fact an excellent book that came out about 15 years ago. Was the first important feminist analysis of masculinity that came out of Southern Africa. And the designer of the cover has made something of a feature of part of the content of the book, that is that there's no such thing as a homogeneous African or even Southern African masculinity, but there are multiple forms of masculinity and multiple interconnections and interweavings of them. Work of that kind has flourished in South America, especially interestingly in Chile. It's developed in India in connection especially with feminist anti-violence programs. It's developed in Southeast Asia and the Pacific also. These are, if you like, projects that are recognisable and understandable within the terms of gender analysis that have come from the global north. But there are also knowledge projects that come from the south which are not so easily recognisable, not conducted necessarily in the same kind of conceptual language or using the same conceptual tools. I want to mention three types of this, and you will be concerned with these over the next days in much more detail, of course. The first is indigenous knowledge, and indigenous knowledge systems contain a great deal of information, thinking and wisdom about gender issues. I'll just mention someone who many of you will know, Linda Tuiwai-Smith, who's from Aotearoa, New Zealand, whose book Decolonising Methodologies has circulated internationally and is an excellent starting point for thinking about post-colonial issues in social science methods. Second is the kind of project which I would call alternative universalisms. Western science. I hate that expression, but it gets around. Claims to be universal knowledge. Physics claims to be true in the same way everywhere. Biomedical science claims to be true in the same way everywhere, and so forth. But this is not the only claim of universalism that can be made. So other knowledge systems exist which also attempt to speak to a potentially global audience. And by far the best known of those is Islamic knowledge, Islamic science. And in respect of gender relations, Islamic feminisms. Here I would refer particularly to a feminist from Morocco, Fatima Mernissi, who was actually one of the pioneers of studies of men and feminist research on men and masculinities. Although she wasn't noticed as such because she was writing about Morocco. And when the Americans and Europeans got interested in these matters 10 years later, they began doing the same kind of thing. But that's sort of my story about Mernissi. But what is even more significant about her, I think, is that she's one of the people who have really tried to think through what it means to use Islamic knowledge methodologies in thinking about gender issues and gender inequality. So she's one of the people, given that the central forms of Islamic knowledge involve reading and reflecting on texts, especially the Quran, but the Hadith, the attested sayings of the Prophet, and the various commentaries on these. Mernissi, like other Islamic feminists, have been concerned to use these methodologies of knowledge production for thinking about questions of gender inequality. And I can commend her work as well as other work. Some of this work is available in English, although Mernissi's initial work in this was in French, as a really significant way of breaking out, if you like, of the conventions of the knowledge system that derives from Europe and North America, to get a very different way of thinking about gender questions. Finally, there's what the approach that I've called Southern theory, which I guess is more a slogan than a concept, which is to look at the way knowledge is generated out of the colonial experience itself. And Islamic knowledge pre-existed European colonization of the Islamic world. But knowledge also arises in the colonial encounter and in the struggles that colonialism, colonial society, and decolonization give rise to. That is also a process that produces knowledge. And in my book Southern Theory, I actually sort of set out to trawl around the post-colonial world, looking for forms of social theory that reflected that colonial and post-colonial experience primarily, rather than the experience of the global north. And that process also happens in respect of gender, knowledge about gender. Here's one of the, another person who I think is a profoundly important modern feminist thinker, recently died, unfortunately, Helena Safiotti from Brazil. Safiotti published back in 1969 a book called Woman in Class Society. Remember 69, that's before the famous American and British texts of women's liberation were published. She was, part of the left-wing opposition to the Brazilian military dictatorship. She came out of a Marxist milieu, and much of her thought was influenced by structuralist Marxism, but it was also feminist. And her book is absolutely, for my money, absolutely riveting analysis of gender questions in the colonisation and post-colonial development of Brazil, a story we hardly hear about in Australia. But it's a brilliant book, a pioneering study, one of the most important, a real breakthrough, I think, in developing a social theory of gender, a structural analysis that combines culture, economics, political processes, the colonial state, in the context of colonisation and post-colonial development. Really remarkable stuff. And it's not only in Brazil that we find this kind of work. So, to finish, I want to say simply, look, there's immense resources out there for rethinking gender questions in a genuinely global, on a world scale, out of the multiple experiences of the colonised and post-colonial world, as well as the experiences of the global metropole. It's sometimes tempting to say, look, let's just throw away the European and North American stuff and get to where the action is. We don't need to do that. I mean, there are resources there. Europe and North America have tremendous knowledge institutions, resources, powerful intellectual culture. Why should we give that up? But we don't need to be stuck in an attitude of extroversion and intellectual dependence for it. We have tremendous resources for other ways of thinking, which are available around the world if you go looking for them. It does take a bit of work, but they are there. They can be accessed. And I think that will be necessary in the next generation of feminist work, to have that kind of world intellectual resource to support the next generation of struggle, which will increasingly be conducted on an international scale, given the world we are now in. Thank you.
Thank you. As always, I found it really stimulating. And I mean, I think the point that you made, particularly in response to Shale, is so important, that actually it's not just that there's an ethical imperative to actually reach out and learn and read these other people and these other perspectives, but that actually they might do something really useful for us understanding things that we currently can't actually understand. But my question was really a really practical one of, showing the tables of journals where we are expected to publish, where genuine knowledge and theory is produced. How can we resist that? And following on from that, there was a follow-up to that bit, which I've completely lost now. Yes, and also adding on to that, it's wonderful, and one of the things I love about your work is that you actually point us in the direction of these people who have been excluded, or these important theorists that we should be going to read. But what are some of the strategies that we can actually use to be able to expand our gaze and actually be able to find and engage with these more marginal voices when we're operating within a system that so consciously excludes them and makes it so difficult to actually find?
Yeah, absolutely. When I first heard about Huntonji, for instance, I first heard about him when I was visiting South Africa, and got home and actually read one of his texts and thought, wow, I want to read more of this stuff. So I went to the university library, Sydney University Library, the biggest university library in the country probably, not a word of Ntanji's work there. I went to Interlibrary Loan, please find me this book in some other, and the key book, which is called Indigenous Knowledge, there was one copy in Australia. One copy. It was in Western Australia, actually. Good for them. But that's the scale. That's the size of the practical problem. Yes. Look, I would be very interested in hearing, in pooling ideas about this kind of problem. What do you actually do to change these relationships, these practices? I can tell you a bit about what I've tried to do, but I don't, that there are many other kinds of approaches people could take. I've, having a bit of leverage within institutions, have tended to work within, the existing university system. One of the things I've tried to do is get, given that we have the league table, we have a apparatus of a whole set of journals which are hungry for material, persuade the journals to do some of this work themselves and start looking for knowledge workers in the global south that they can connect with and whose work they can publish. Journals like Gender and Education, for instance. I published a paper that made this kind of argument in the field of education, and that journal has actually been looking for this kind of work. And there's a very interesting discussion of the problem in an issue of that journal about 2 years ago, a little essay by Marilia Carvalho from Brazil in Gender and Education, which is a British journal, which discusses this problem from a Brazilian point of view. Well worth reading. But a journal like that is actually willing to move a bit. Another one which has sort of taken up the point is the journal Feminist Theory. And together with one of the regular editors of Feminist Theory, that's another English-produced journal, Celia Roberts, I've been editing a special issue composed of feminist theoretical work from the Global South. In fact, the first papers from that had just come online a week ago. If anyone wants to go to the website for Feminist Theory, you'll see half a dozen of these papers already. So that's one kind of strategy, boring from within, to try to use the existing mechanisms and change their content, turn them around, so that they become a means of disseminating work from the majority world rather than simply imposing northern work on the rest of the world. But that's only one kind of approach, and it also requires changing forms of circulation and access. So it seems to me that the debate around open access, for instance, is really important. As the academic publishing system has been increasingly monopolised by a small group of transnational corporations run by blokes like the one whom I showed holding up the world, Elsevier and Sage, and there are 5 corporations now which publish 50% of all journal articles in all disciplines in the world. I mean, it's just an astonishing level of control. And of course, charging, they make their money by charging universities and readers for access to this stuff. So the struggle for open access is really important for intellectual workers in the majority world. Putting energy into that is also a worthwhile approach. And harassing feminist journals in the north and in the global north to take account of this and make themselves open access, even if it means changing the business model and changing their status. those are kinds of things we can do, but I'd be really interested to hear about other people's approaches and strategies.
Akil.
Mr. Connell, you had two themes, feminism and the viewpoints of the South, and I was wondering if we can explore the affinities between them by looking at what you were suggesting about alternative universalisms. So just to take up something that surfaced briefly when we talked during the break, if we look at medical knowledges of the South, and there's a standard universalist response from the North that is concessive about the efficacies of Southern medicine, medical traditions, but immediately adds to the concession that even when they're efficacious, their efficacy is explained by an underlying theoretical account, which also explains the efficacies of medical knowledges of the North, so standardly allopathic. So that's the universalist move, which is not to insist that your medical knowledge is the only one, but to insist that even if alternative knowledges are efficacious, their efficacy is explained by a common underlying theory. And I was wondering if much of the feminist understanding of the notions of the body in the last 50 years or so in the North could be deployed here to come up with a much more sympathetic understanding of how medical knowledges of the South really must have a different conception of the body too. Because for them, the very idea of medical cure is not just a cure of the body, but a cure of, but a restoration of emotions and meanings and so on as well. That is, there is no cure until there is cure of that much more rounded form, which suggests that the body is shot through with meanings and emotions and so on. And so there's an underlying incommensurate conception of cure and body. And this is something that feminists have been saying in recent years. So there's a real alliance here, at least potentially, between conceptions of the South about medicine and feminist understandings of the body. It's just an exploratory thought.
It's a good thought, and I think there are certainly there are ways you could develop that. There's particular fields in which you could develop that line of thought very effectively. I've read, for instance, some West African discussion of what in the Western tradition is called mental illness, which work in that kind of way, and which seem to me in some ways reminiscent of some of the anti-psychiatry literature that came out in the context of Western medicine back in the 1960s. One has to acknowledge that there are significant groups of intellectuals in different parts of the periphery, majority world, perhaps better shorthand, who absolutely reject Northern, or as they call it, Western feminism, who regard this as an imperialist project in itself, imposing a Eurocentric view of the body and of society on other cultures. Sometimes the politics of this is very dire indeed. These this rejection, comes from men who might be regarded as adopting, strongly patriarchal positions, and who feel themselves under threat from the international spread of feminist ideas. Some of it comes from women who, sometimes adopting a fairly simplified view of what Western feminism is, nevertheless think that it undermines some sources of women's strength. So there is an African discourse, for instance, some of it from expatriates in North America, some of it in Africa, which constructs a discussion of what we might call gender issues around the idea of motherhood and women's strength based on their social role as mothers, and rejects the idea of gender altogether on that basis. Some argue that in pre-colonial societies there was no such thing as gender, just as some argue that there was no such thing as homosexuality before the arrival of the decadent West. And I, although I find those positions politically very troubling, I don't doubt they have some bases in experience, and if not, homogenous local cultures, then at least some local practices and traditions, and therefore must be taken account of if we're taking a democratic and inclusive approach to knowledge. So I guess what I'm pointing to is that there may be some limits to the search for affinities and correspondences between Western medical knowledge and the healing practices and knowledge of colonised people, which we'd also have to bring into play. But what perhaps excites me here, and in gender studies quite generally, is the possibility of new combinations. Do people know the story of the indigenous knowledge issue in relation to AIDS in South Africa, where about 15 years ago, when Thabo Mbeki was president, a situation arose where the government rejected the viral explanation of AIDS as containing, as representing, if you like, a Western and racist put down of the sexuality of Africans, especially African men, argued that AIDS was basically a disease of poverty, which is perfectly true, and also that it could be responded to, that it could be, the epidemic could be resolved by indigenous healing practices. And a really terrible and disastrous situation arose where Western medical knowledge was absolutely pitted against what was said to be indigenous knowledge, arguably not that at all, but that was the banner under which the alternative went. Whereas I think the only constructive way of operating in that situation would be what gradually, and with great difficulty and a great loss of life, gradually emerged, which is some kind of combination of the healing technologies that came from, northern biomedicine and the healing practices and caring practices that were available in local communities, many of which, of course, were now urban and not in traditional homelands at all. So it's the possibility of new combinations and inventiveness coming out of the interplay of knowledge system that in a way excites me about this whole area.
Nick.
Well, I guess my question is related. I thought your presentation was very wonderful in the way it mapped out different theoretical voices and around the globe. It's very global. I'm wanting to pose the question of knowledge, and I think everybody in this room is a pluralist about knowledge. We all believe and are committed to plural epistemologies. At the same time, I'm wondering if there's a danger, or I'll just present it as a worry, that as we open up the academic space for voices that have been left out of it or not noticed at all because that space is constructed by the North and its knowledge dispositions and orientations and its total command almost of the very production of knowledge. Whether we may just acquire more knowledge, more plurality, more epistemic perspectives, but the question of knowledge doesn't actually get posed directly. In other words, what I'm wanting to ask is, in your journey through this topos, these different voices that have obviously inspired and transformed your own thinking, is there also a change in what counts as knowledge? Because we could actually incorporate everything that's on the table in your presentation and have, in a sense, the same notion of knowledge standing at the end of the day and the same conditions of production perhaps as well. So what I'm wondering is there something in your own sort of biographical encounter with these theoretical perspectives that point to new possibilities of what knowledge could or should be beyond what we, all of us, produce and reproduce daily? We're always making judgments. This qualifies to meet the test epistemically and this other stuff, and we do it just automatically. It's how we're built. So I'm wondering if you can point to some example of where it made a real difference for you, where something started to count not just as an important voice, but as a different way of thinking about knowledge, and maybe the way where gender and coloniality meet in that encounter.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues that radiate out from what you've said. So I certainly don't have a well-formed view of them. I've got some bits of ideas about them. Coming back to my friend Pauline Mutonji, in Endogenous Knowledge, he and the group, it's a group book, it's a book that incorporates a number of studies of different fields of knowledge in West Africa. The researchers grapple with the question of truth. So what, if you like, what our claim to respect in the university and research world is that we have some kind of access to truth. We are able to speak the truth, the classic, political position of the intellectual speaking truth to power. Well, you've got to have some truth, some claim of truth to be able to do that. And here in the post-colonial situation in West Africa, they were confronting different kinds of claims of truth. And Huntonji takes the position, and his mates, take the position that there must be a possibility of mutual critique. You can't just, sellotape together different forms of knowledge in a kind of kaleidoscope, mosaic, and think you've got something better. Different knowledge systems have to be able to talk to each other, criticise each other, and that's uncomfortable in a situation of unequal power. I don't know where to go with that, but I think they are right, that if we are to have a worthwhile pluralism in the realm of knowledge, that must incorporate the possibility of mutual critique, mutual learning, all right, but not just a reproduction of the position from which everyone starts. My second thought is to when you ask how this enterprise has changed my thinking about knowledge, is to push me to think more about the practices in which knowledge is located or held. So what are the forms of knowledge talk? Okay, we have a very ritualised form of knowledge talk in the form of the journal article or the monograph or the academic lecture, for heaven's sake, what I was doing myself. But there are other forms of talking that deploy knowledge, that contain knowledge, and which perhaps are less exclusionary than these ritualised forms of knowledge talk that are central in academic life. That, I think, is perhaps, if we think about it that way, and I'm thinking especially of forms of education that are not dominated by a hierarchical certification process, like the awarding of degrees. So, for instance, community education processes, TAFE as it used to be, before it was neoliberalised, and there's still a bit of outreach, a bit of democratic education left in the TAFE system. Points where educational processes are going on that include social groups who are marginalised from the mainstream knowledge economy. That would be, I've come to think those kinds of practices are more important and may become very crucial in the on a global scale. But perhaps the best example I could give from my own experience of going down this path and having to rethink my own assumptions about knowledge is around the issue of land. It just never occurred to me when I began, I've written a whole gigantic monograph about gender theory, a book called Gender and Power, which has actually got around a bit. It was nearly 30 years ago. It doesn't mention the word land. The concept didn't cross my mind when I was writing this book. So being obliged to think about issues of land as I, like many other white intellectuals in Australia, began to come to terms with the Aboriginal cultural revival, with the growth of the land rights movement and the obvious importance of the critique of the coloniality of Australian culture. And putting that together with what I was coming into contact with as I read more of the feminist literature from the post-colonial world, and encountering people like Bina Agarwal's work most dramatically, has forced me to rethink the terms, not just of gender theory, but of all forms of social theory that have operated, by excluding, what was going on in most of the world, that is the huge land appropriation process that colonialism represented. So I'm sure I'm only at the early stages of thinking through the implications of understanding the social as interwoven with land and ocean, as Epeli Alpha points out, that for Pacific peoples, it's the ocean which is crucial. But that's certainly, had a powerful impact on my thinking, and I hope it will on other people too.
So I'm going to insert myself into the list here because it follows up these questions and I think connects back to Kieran's as well. So part of what I hear in this conversation is the need to rethink what we mean by standards of excellence, right? We all think we should have standards of excellence. We apply them, we're called on to apply them all the time. But what should those standards be? And then what should the modes of production of knowledge be? And so the connection back to your question is I was thinking, there was a time when it became important that every panel at the American Political Science meetings had at least one woman on it. The philosophers are not so keen on this, but but it's a pretty broad standard. But so that could be expanded. So you don't publish in a special issue of a journal if all the participants are from the North. You say, I just don't do that kind of thing. And you don't participate on a panel if all the participants are from the North. And as an academic, so of course you have to have a certain level of security before you can participate in this. So that is definitely a caveat. But those of us who are in those positions should start wielding our authority. And when our universities tell us that your publications count less, if it's published in a Canadian journal instead of an international journal, you go back and say, what? Why would that be? And you say, I'm only going to publish in open access journals, and you let people know that. So I think there are just a variety of ways in which those of us who have secure academic positions could wield that power to shift the norms. And I don't think it's going to happen unless we choose to do that. So, but last comment on the kind of methodologies of production of knowledge. So some years ago I had an Aboriginal graduate student who did the obligatory second year presentation, and at that the graduate director was there, and she said, so now my methodology will be my beadwork. And she showed a nice slide of her beadwork, and I thought, I'm going to get a phone call about it. And I did get a phone call, but it was an open phone call, kind of. So tell me, will there be some text here? So this is one of the issues: is text the only form of knowledge production that really counts? Does dance count? Does beadwork count? Do oral conversations with the community count? And again, as senior academics, we can wield a little bit of authority over that. We say, well, I say it counts. My dissertation student gets to count that as part of the knowledge production. Usually, I think for quite the foreseeable future, some text will be required, but it doesn't have to be all text. And as we move in that direction, we shift the modes of our understanding of knowledge production.
So I just want to so long as we're also engaged in the certification of knowledge of our students, whether they're doing beadwork or something else, somebody's going to ask the question: is this good beadwork?
Yes.
Is this a good dissertation?
Yes, and that's why I started with the excellence, and are we
We don't judge people.
exactly?
It's not our skill.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So then we need to bring in other kinds of experts to help us with these assessments, because for the foreseeable future, there is going to be a hierarchy of knowledge production. There's going to be a certification of knowledge capacities, and so then they're going to be excellent judgments.
Yeah, totally agree. One thing that has worried me in pursuing this line of work is that the mainstream economy of knowledge is smart and has means of dealing with dissent. So that back in the, I go back to the 1960s, believe it or not, and back in the 1960s, young radical social scientists, sociologists in particular, thought of themselves as Marxists. So, and I remember going to a conference in the United States for the American Sociological Association, where there was an insurgent sociologist position from the young radicals against the boring old mainstream. The boring old mainstream, however, won out eventually by saying, yes, this is wonderful stuff. We'll make Marx one of the three founding fathers of sociology retrospectively, and that's what you find in all the textbooks now. Good old bearded Karl there, along with Durkheim and Weber, has been elected to the role of founding father. And we'll set up a subsection of the American Sociological Association. We'll call it Marxist sociology, and you can have it. And they did. And they all went off and joined the Marxist sociology subsection. They have their own journal. They meet and talk to each other, and so the mainstream carries on. So there is a risk in of operating in such a way that the major resources of the mainstream institutions, and they're big resources, this huge global university system, and where it's growing fastest in China, it's explicitly modelled on the elite American institutions. That's not an alternative. It's at all in terms of its epistemology. That the mainstream will power on in its own way, and every alternative will be placed in a marginalised position ultimately. Wanting to endorse that, and of course I've done something of the same. I've been involved in, PhDs which were largely art work, with a very limited amount of text. I still, would always argue for continuing struggle within the mainstream institutions, trying to get those resources as far as possible to operate in different ways. It's got to be a multiple strategy. It's got to be going in different directions, and you won't know at the start, what's going to be most productive. And some of them will prove to be dead ends, but some of them will work. Because there is, an enormous democratic pressure, in a way, behind this campaign to open the world of knowledge to wider participation and make its resources democratically available globally.
Allison.
Yeah, I'm also fairly new to Australia, and since I've gotten here, I've become interested in, I've done feminist theory for many years, and I became aware of just how narrow my own boundaries have been. So I've been very interested in the relationship between indigenous women's knowledges and dominant feminisms in Australia, and there's a very fraught, I would say, lack of relationship, basically. So one of the things I've been interested in is Eileen Morton Robinson's critique of dominant feminisms in Australia. And she writes about how transformative of knowledge it would be to take indigenous knowledges seriously. And probably the most important thing is this issue of land. If you really take seriously a different relation to land, and if you follow indigenous understandings of the intimate relationship between knowledge and being and doing, so a different relationship to land that involves a different being and doing with the land, that does really transform your conception of what knowledge is. And one of the points that she makes is that it would mean feminists need to rethink our affinity to this idea of anti-essentialism, of the importance of being fluid and multiple and disconnected from land. So she says that in order to really take indigenous knowledges seriously, we have to be able to rethink our understanding of connection to land and take seriously a form of attachment to land that we have found problematic. So that's one point I wanted to ask you about what you thought of that. And the other one was, because I've also been working on Islamic feminisms, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about what you mean by alternative universalisms in that context.
Yeah, lots there. As you'll know, if you've read Eileen Morton Robinson's book, Talking Up to the White Woman, there was a very sharp conflict between groups of Aboriginal women and white feminism in Australia in the 1990s, particularly over the issue of gender-based violence. And that was, in a way, never resolved. I mean, the issue has reconfigured, but the feeling on the part of many Aboriginal women that white feminism was fundamentally racist, and the feeling on the part of at least some white feminists that this argument minimised the significance of gender-based violence in Aboriginal communities. That was a standoff that has continued to trouble those relationships and make it difficult for new connections to emerge. And I guess, moving from the thing you refer to secondly, that is the shift in northern feminism towards deconstructionist, post-structuralist and queer theory influenced views of gender in terms of fluidity, multiplicity of sexual and gender identities. That hasn't helped. And that really is, I think, a big question, because this has become hegemonic in northern feminism. And if you read books about feminist theory since, I suppose, the mid-1990s, this is front and centre. Judith Butler became the most influential feminist thinker in the world in the 1990s. And although she's often misread and misunderstood, that movement of thought has certainly popularised and disseminated immensely. And it has carried northern academic feminism, I think, a long way from a focus on issues about material injustices, economic inequalities, forms of exploitation that might have made it easier to see the significance of land. So coming back and making that connection now is a very complex and quite difficult intellectual task, because it involves rethinking mainstream, what has become the mainstream of feminist theory in the global north. Now, there are feminist thinkers in the global north who have been criticising that hegemony. We hear of a new feminist materialism, influenced by science and technology studies, which has reasserted, the agency of the material world, if you like. But not much of that has travelled far in the direction of a concern with social justice and questions of poverty, which seem to me, very, very fundamental to any, relinking with indigenous communities, whose economy was destroyed by colonisation, whose social structure was transformed, and who are basically marginal to the contemporary economy in countries like Canada, Australia, the United States. So, a huge amount of work to be done, and part of that is a critical assessment of the internal legacy of northern feminism, I think. It's not going to be a comfortable thing to do, but I guess it has to be done.